Hello, welcome. It is April 7th. It is Thursday. This is our third live review session. Go ahead and if you are logged in, go ahead and add any questions that you have to the MOOC. Remember, we are at www.hgap5.com. There's a place for you to add questions there, and I will be getting those questions and answering them. So this week we're going to talk about politics, which I mentioned last week was kind of one of my personal favorite chapters and concepts that we do in human geography. But before we get too far into the ideas of the politics unit, I want to go back a little bit and just kind of touch on a couple of review concepts from last week. So last week we talked a lot about culture, how culture spreads, how culture is defined, the idea of regions, the idea of diffusion. And one of the things that we really talked about is the importance of culture and kind of defining people's identity. That culture is something that is that you learn, something that you choose and can choose and change over time. And so it's something that becomes very closely embedded into people's lives and how people identify themselves. And that's an important concept because when we talk about politics this week, we're going to talk a lot about some ideas related not to individual identity like last week, but more related to the idea of group identity. So who do I identify with in terms of a group, or in terms of what group am I a part of? What group is like me? So think about this in terms of maybe at school you might have maybe some clubs that you're a part of, or some organizations or sports, or maybe you're in the band or something like that. So think about those as being groups, and think about the way that your group tends to identify itself. So chances are you probably have friends in that group. You probably hang out with people from that group, maybe not exclusively, but you do spend quite a bit of time with those folks. You have shared experiences. Your shared experiences may be around the activities of the clubs or practices or performances, and you spend a lot of time with people, and therefore you kind of build some common bonds with people. And within your larger community, within your school community, you are probably to some extent identified with that group. So, oh, well, so-and-so was in the band. And just people may make assumptions about you based on the group that you're a part of. And I'm not saying that making assumptions about people based on their group is a good thing or a positive thing, but it probably is something that happens. But within the group, there's always some kind of close bonds that develop because of those common experiences. Or when you're looking for advice or help, that's a group of people where you've built trust, and where I have the hiccups today, and I apologize, and where you've built some relationships. And so within the larger community of your school, you kind of have these smaller clusters of people which you have voluntarily kind of joined. And that's similar to what we want to talk about in terms of group identity, except group identity is not always based on things that we choose. I think we could kind of describe group identity in terms of, to what extent do we prioritize one part of our identity over another? Does that make sense? So you might be in the band, and then you also might be in the debate club, or you might also be in art, or you might also be a human geography student, right? So you have all of these different parts of your identity, all these different parts of who you are. And at some point in life, we start to make choices about what parts of that identity we want to focus on and we want to put forward publicly. We want to make, part of who we are. So, So, for example, I'm Scotch, Irish, and German by my heritage. My family has never really made a big deal about that. Being Scotch, Irish, and German has never been very important to us. It's just an identity, right? And so that's part of my identity but it's not a part that I really stress, right? If we live, I live in Texas, and I know some of my people watching tonight are also people that live in Texas. I have my Texas Rangers jersey on today. Anyway, so and people in Texas often have a very strong state identity. So they often associate themselves with their state just as strongly, if not more strongly, than with the United States. But that's a choice that they make. So they sometimes choose to say, this is who I am. And so there are many complex things that come into how people identify in terms of group identity. And that's an important concept. So it may be based on nationality, where you were born or where your family was born. It may be based on some racial component, right? I'm based on my skin color, or based on my heritage, based on some of those common bonds that I share with people in those ways. It may be based on, more and more often in my school and in high schools, I think around the country, sexual identity, even amongst high school kids, is becoming a more common thing. So identify as LGBT, I identify as this, I identify as that. And so it's all about which of those identities, which of those pieces of who we are, we choose to stress. And sometimes we stress things differently at different times. And sometimes we make strategic decisions. Sometimes it's beneficial to stress one thing over another. Some of you will be applying for college in the near future, and sometimes identity, in how you play that identity game can be very helpful to you in that. So some of these things are choices that we make. Some of these things that we're born with. Some of these things are, just which people are like us in some way that we choose to have close connections and close bonds with. Okay, and that's an important thing to understanding, kind of the idea of group identity. All right, so how is this important to politics? Well, there's kind of three vocabulary terms that I want to define, and it's very important that we define these, because these are some of I think some of the most misused concepts in our nation. And I just used one of them incorrectly. In our country, here in the United States, right? And that is the idea of state, the idea of nation, and the idea of nation state, and what those things are. And I want to start with the idea of a nation. So nation is a group of people. On its most fundamental definition, nation means group of people. So when we talk about the Choctaw Nation, I live just south of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma border, and right across the border is the Choctaw Indian Reservation. So the Choctaw Nation, okay, that place, that area is culturally dominated by people who are Choctaw. They are common, have a common ancestry, have a common history, have had common experiences, okay, and they identify with that, and they put forth that identity as being important to them. Okay, right next to them is the Chickasaw Nation, right, who has their own identity. Ironically, in this case, both of those groups are part of the much larger nation of the Cherokee Nation. Right, the Cherokee, I'm sure you have learned about in U.S. history, were relocated from the southeast in Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama to what is now Oklahoma. I think the common thought is that the Cherokee people, in reality, there's lots of different groups that are Cherokee, right? So these are all different types of identities, right? So it could be based on something like that. So nation is a group of people that identify themselves with other people that are like them. A lot of times that could be based on language, but based on religion, based on other cultural customs, based on history, based on experiences, all kinds of different things. One is that in the 20th century, one of the things that was very common was for political leaders to try to create nations or create identities for people that may or may not have been important before, right? How can we carve out a group of people to identify with that may not have had a strong identification before? And can we find something in common that allows us to create a group, right? And this is not common, but it happened a lot in the 20th century. A lot of the end of World War I and the end of World War II was a lot about this carving out of identities and finding these niches. A lot of times, though, these nations and these identities are very, very well established historically. So nation is a group of people, okay? A state is a political entity, right? It is an area, it is a location that has fixed permanent boundaries, and it has a power structure that is autonomous. Okay, so within a state, people make decisions that have no higher authority. Okay, so in the United States, we are actually a country. Nobody can really tell us what to do, right? Now, you may argue, well, what if we do something wrong? Can people go to war with us? Absolutely, right? But our government does not have to get approval from other people in order to do things, right? And that's what defines a state. So for our purposes, state and country are kind of the same thing, all right, for our purposes, in that they are fixed areas with fixed boundaries, and there is a autonomous or there's no higher authority within that area. So France gets to make its own decisions. Germany makes its own decisions. Italy, Turkey, Russia, Uzbekistan, whatever. They have boundaries, and they have the power to make their own decisions. Those are states. Now, if we merge those two ideas together, and what we have is a nation state. Okay? A nation state is a physical area that has fixed boundaries, and that has to rely on does not have to rely on higher authorities. At the same time, it is homogeneously one nation. So everybody within that, or the vast majority, I should say, of people within that, the boundaries of that state, identify the same way or identify with the same group. That is a nation state. Okay? State is people. I'm sorry. Nation is people. State is location with boundaries. Nation state merges those two together. Okay? Basically, 500 years ago, when this idea of nation state kind of was first articulated, nation states were fairly common. A lot of places basically said everyone that's here is going to be called this, and we're going to put a boundary around us, and we're going to be a nation state. There are very, very, very few nation states left in the world. And the reason for that is it's almost impossible anymore to find places in which everybody, or the vast majority of people in a country, have the same identity, unless that identity has somehow been created. Okay, some examples. Japan is very close to what we would consider a nation state, because most of Japan identifies historically, culturally, the same way. Okay, and that goes way back for 1,000 years. Part of the reason why they have been able to maintain that is that they have historically been very hostile towards immigration. They don't let a lot of people in, and therefore their culture has remained fairly consistently the same. Most other places on the planet Earth have much more diversity within the boundaries of their state. So you may have 2, 3, 4, 300 in some places, right? Different groups that identify differently. So you may have many, many, many nations within a state. Okay. When we have a nation within a state, it's called an overbounded state. Okay. What that means is that the boundaries are too big to encapsulate the individual states. Now, that may not be a practical thing. If you go to Nigeria, where there's 80 some odd ethnic groups, and you create a little country for each of them, a state for each of those, I don't know how well that's going to work, right? They may get along better, but as a you know, I don't need them, right? But that's the way that works. Another problem is when we have what's called underbounded states. Underbounded states are when we have a state or a nation that overflows the boundaries, right? It's much bigger than the boundaries that are defined for it, right? One of the classic examples of this are the Kurds that live in Central Asia and Southwest Asia. So they live in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, and their ethnic group, or this very large nation. They don't have their own state, and they overflow into 4 or 5 different states. All right. And so in order to create a state for them, you would have to carve out territory from 4 or 5 different existing states to create one for them. All right. So the nation state concept, while important historically, and it acts as a very nice starting point for us to understand the importance of identity in politics, is really an antiquated, out-of-date idea. Really, when we talk about identity politics in the world today, it's really about how do we balance multi-ethnic states? How do we balance, states that have borders that contain lots of different people, all right? And this works lots of different ways. In some cases, there's no problem. Everybody gets along fine. In a lot of cases, though, they don't, right? And part of the reason why they don't is that not everyone has access to power, or at least not everybody perceives that they have the same access to power, right? And so states are constantly struggling with this idea of identity and power within the bounds of a state. And how do we balance that, right? How do we make that happen, right? So if we look at the late 20th century, the way that that was balanced was, in most cases, you had some kind of authoritarian government that kind of trumped everybody, that made everybody's personal identity unimportant, and suppressed identities to some common idea or some common person or belief structure. So we can talk about the Soviet Union. We can talk about military dictators in Asia. We can talk about military dictators in Latin America, right? Where they said, I am in charge, I'm running the show, we're all going to identify the way that I say we identify, right? And then, so that was one way to deal with the problem, was to simply use authoritarian tactics and power to suppress identities, right? You don't get to be and act and participate in your life the way you want to, because it's interfering with me. So while dictatorship in general is really, really bad, if you have problems with ethnic conflict, sometimes those dictators can kind of make that problem go away. They bring on lots of other problems, right? But order tends to not be a problem with dictators or with authoritarian leaders, right? So that's one way to solve the problem, is through dictatorship. I am not recommending that as a solution. I want to go on record. Mr. C is not recommending that we put dictators to keep people in line. However, caveat, I think there's lots of historical examples of when strong dictators have been removed, and all of a sudden those groups are free to express their identities in groups, has led to renewed conflict. Okay, in Europe and Southwest Asia, places like that are some really, really good examples of this, right? Europe has had a long history of this. Okay, if we look, for example, at Ireland and the UK, so in the 1920s. Ireland broke away from the UK in the Civil War, but a small portion, six counties or so in Northern Ireland, stayed part of the UK. Part of that division was based on religious identification, that those Northern Irish were Protestant, were British Protestants, while the rest of Ireland was Roman Catholic, right? So they broke away, created 2 states. There has been ongoing conflict, however, within those 6 counties ever since, and to this day, about whether or not those 6 counties should be able what we call Ulster in Northern Ireland, should they be able to identify politically with the Irish, who are their cultural and historical relatives, or with the UK, who currently has the power there. Now, this particular conflict got really bad and really violent in the 1970s and through the 1990s. For the most part now, most of the violence in that conflict has died down, and it continues to be a peaceful political struggle. But that's an example, right? So we had this power, we had strong imperialist powers that ruled Ireland. Eventually, Ireland broke away, but that ongoing residual conflict over identity. A better, more recent example, and I say more recent just because, in my lifetime, right, it's kind of the big example in my lifetime is what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So when the Soviet-controlled government of Tito disappears. Actually, I don't know if Tito was actually still alive then, but whoever the Soviet communist was, when that person went away, all of a sudden now these many different nationalist groups and ethnic groups in Yugoslavia now felt that they had the power to seize some ownership and to seize control of their state. And there were several groups that broke away. So Slovenia broke away, Croatia broke away, things like that. The problem is that in some of the interior parts of Yugoslavia, in Serbia and Bosnia and Kosovo and Montenegro, places like that, so it wasn't like you had one ethnic group or one particular national group that all have the same identity. You had lots of different ones. So when these went away, there was a lot of conflict and civil war that happened because the people that were powerful traditionally in those society were the Serbs, and the Serbs did not want to let go of this territory. And so there's a lot of conflict between those who wanted to be independent and the Serbs who didn't want to let that happen. So we got a problem with the power struggle or the power balance in these states. This leads to civil war. It leads to some horrible things in terms of genocide, in terms of what they called ethnic cleansing, to get rid of people that were not Serb or were not like them. And so that's this example of what happens. So when that overarching power is removed, in this particular case, the state broke apart. And in breaking apart, some parts were not able freely. Excuse me. They were forced to have to go through a horrible, terrible, violent episode in order to break away. Okay? Now, and there's lots of different examples from different parts of Europe. The Basques in Spain are an example. They consider themselves ethnically and culturally different from many from the rest of Spain, especially from those who are in power in Spain. In southern Spain, where Barcelona is, in the Catalonian region, there's some ethnic and nationalist sentiment about maybe they want to break away in the future. That really hasn't picked up a lot of steam like the Basques have in the north. But most countries in Europe have some of these things because over time there's been so much migration, so much movement of peoples, so much displacement of people because of different causes. You have lots of religions, lots of ethnicities, lots of different ideologies, lots of different histories, lots of different experiences, all kind of mixing together, especially in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe's really bad about this. Bad isn't the word, but it's very common there, right? And so what we end up with is this kind of fruit bowl of different ideas and different concepts, and they're all trying to live together, and they're all trying to find a niche of power for themselves. So what does power look like for me and my people? How do I have power to maintain my people the way that they should be? And when that power doesn't exist, that leads to tension, sometimes to violence. Okay, there are peaceful solutions to these. So Belgium, for example, has two dominant groups. It has the Flemings and the Walloons. Okay, and the way they solved this problem was that they just created a government in which these two groups basically shared power. They're basically equal. So there hasn't been a lot of ethnic conflict in in Belgium over this. Okay, Czechoslovakia, which broke up after the end of the Soviet Cold War era, solved this problem by creating two countries. Okay, you have the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That's how they chose to do that. What made that solution possible, though, was there was some nice division, nice clear delineations between those groups, right? They weren't nearly as intermixed or intermingled as they were, say, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or as they might have been in, say, for example, Iraq or Turkey or Iran, where those groups are very much mixed together. Part of that mixing comes from this idea of sequent occupants, this idea that, especially in Southwest Asia, for thousands of years, new groups moved in, settled, left, were driven away, and this just over and over and over. And every time a group would come in, they would leave a cultural imprint on the land. They would leave some kind of remnant of people. And so what we end up with is this very complicated mix of the way people kind of live together. I think one of the things that's important to talk about, though, is that this is this idea of geopolitics, the idea of politics of identity, the idea of politics of the people that live near you, is a little hard for us to grasp in the U.S. because we are a relatively young society, right? We've only been around about 500 years, if you go all the way back to the first European settlers, right? And assuming we only look at once Europeans showed up, because we've kind of unfortunately gotten rid of everybody else, right? So if we go back to this, 500-year period, we haven't been around very long, because we are surrounded on all four sides of our continents of the Americas by water. For most of that time, we were relatively isolated. It was hard to get here. It was hard to migrate here. So we remained relatively isolated from people. We have pretty good relationships with our neighbors. I know we tend to think about Mexico as being this horribly dangerous place. It's really not, compared to some other parts of the world. We get along very well with Canadians. We get along very well with Mexico. We get very well along very well with Central America and South America, right? We live in a relatively harmonious, relatively peaceful place. Other parts of the world aren't like that. Other parts of the world, sharing borders brings problems, okay? Because in other parts of the world, what happens in your country affects me, because we share a border, or we share a river access, or we share this resource pool, okay? And so what happens in other countries affects them a lot more than it has for us for a long time. That's changing now, because we're not as isolated as we used to be. But for example, countries in Southwest Asia, right? What happens in Afghanistan affects Iran, affects China, affects Russia, affects Turkey. So all of those things have this rippling effect that really makes focusing on what your neighbors are doing very important. And it makes understanding their ethnic and cultural and nationalistic situations very important, and understanding how those things affect you, right? So when we look at other world leaders and we look at other world situations, they're a lot more complex in terms of understanding their neighbors than they are here, right? And in understanding the impact of that. We simply lack some of that bigger picture perspective in the U.S. because we are so isolated, right? And because people who come here, for the most part, want to come here and want to be part of it. Come here are because it is harder to get here, are kind of cutting ties or limiting their ties to their home countries and things like that. And so I think we lack some perspective on those geopolitical realities that are very common in other parts of the world. Okay, so that's a little bit about the interaction, I would say, between the ideas of nation and state and nation state and identity and kind of geopolitics and things like that. Personally believe that these are incredibly important things to understand in the world today, right? I think most of the conflicts that we see today after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, I would argue that most of what we see is a result of that conflict between identity and the need, or people trying to use identity to gain power, or trying to find power to do that. Okay, so keeping this idea of Europe in mind, and Europe is really a great example when we talk about these political questions, because it symbolizes two things. It symbolizes what we call devolution, where the breaking apart of societies and the breaking apart of states based on these lines that are drawn, right, amongst these groups. At the same time, though, it also represents this idea of supranationalism. So on the same region is giving us examples of the break apart of societies along ethnic and then national lines, and a greater sense of community and cooperation. And one great example of this is the European Union. Okay, and it all comes back to this idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty is an important concept. I'm not sure if it's on your vocab list. It should be if it's not. Sovereignty simply means, it gets back to that concept from a few minutes ago of who is the highest authority. Okay, if you are the highest authority in an area, you are sovereign. Okay, so in Europe, there are 50 some odd sovereign states. All right, that's just a reality. However, over the course of the last 50 years or so, many of those states have looked at their particular individual situation and have decided that I can continue to live completely on my own and do everything the way I want to, or I can seek a greater sense of cooperation with my neighbors in order that we may benefit each other, right? And this is stronger than just, it started off as an economic alliance, but it has since grown. And so we have this idea of the common European economic system, the European Union, things like this. And this is significant because things like this require states to think about sovereignty, and if maintaining absolute sovereignty is in their best interest. Okay, in order for us to work together, I have to give up some sovereignty. Okay, in order for us to have a European citizenship, I have to give up a little bit in terms of the complete right to define citizenship. Right, in order for us to have a unified currency, I have to give up some economic sovereignty. In order for us to have a common security and military establishment, I have to give up some of that authority. So at the same time, we have states giving up authority in order to join together into stronger groups of states. At the very same time, we have states that are nations that are gaining statehood by breaking away from other states. So on one hand, we have the breaking apart, and we have the larger combination of things all at the same time. So this idea of supranationalism and devolution is at play in the same region at the same time. Okay, I find this concept fascinating. This idea that we can have both of those things in the same time, in the same place, all happening at it's just fascinating. All right. So let me touch on a couple more things about politics that I think are important to remember. All right. I want to differentiate a little bit between two concepts that are very important, especially in the context of Europe, which is, well, that's always the region that I focus on when we do politics for obvious reasons that I've already kind of talked about. And these devolutionary and supranationalist and nationalist and all these kind of things, they apply in lots of different places. Mexico has these things. Canada's got a strong nationalist movement. All parts of Africa have them. So it's not limited to Europe. Europe is just a nice, convenient package where all of these things are happening. I want to differentiate between a couple of important concepts that tie into this idea of nationalism and states and power and things like that. So I want to talk about the difference between two concepts that are important. One is what we call colonialism, and one is what we call imperialism. And on their surface, they're similar concepts. They mean similar things. But historically, they actually end up being different. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about colonialism. So colonialism, for those of you who have taken the first half of U.S. history, you should be familiar with colonialism. We're familiar with that here in the United States. Why? Because we started off as British colonies, right? Or Spanish colonies if you're from Florida, or Mexican colonies if you're from Texas, or whatever, right? French colonies if you're from North Dakota. Anyway, so we started off with colonies. So basically, what happened is in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, monarchs began to take a greater control over the economic activities in their state, in their country. They began to kind of unify things, and they began to implement more state control over economic activities, even more than the feudal times, right? And part of this was expansion, that Europeans felt the need to expand to new territory. They felt that they needed more resources. They felt that they needed more markets for their goods and services and the things that were being created. And so they would expand other places. So we can talk about the Spanish and their colonization of the New World. We could talk about the Dutch in places like Indonesia. We can talk about the French in places like Canada. We can talk about all these different colonial powers, Portugal and Brazil. We can talk about all these different European powers expanding to new places. And what they would do for the most part is that in Spain was a little different, but what they would do for the most part is they would try to transform that place to look very much like their place, right? So they would send over boatloads of settlers, and they would settle these areas. They would bring over goods and products from their home countries, and they would build homes to look like that, and they would instill their cultural and political structures there. So that basically they were creating a little place, right? So New England was designed to look and act and function very much like Old England, right? New Spain was designed very much to function very much like Old Spain, right? However, the ultimate goal of these places, for the most part, was economic. And the goal was, we are sending people over there, we're recreating our culture and our environment and our system and our structures so that these people can feel comfortable in the job we have for them, which is extractive, right? It is to extract the resources from the land and send it over to us, okay? So we can talk about the nice triangular trade route, right, that happened between Europe, Africa, and the New World, and kind of how those goods and services moved in circles. So colonies were set up for political and economic purposes. And what the really important thing about the colonial period is that it was designed to recreate the home country there. That eventually changes because places like the United States, places like Latin America, eventually they get tired of the economic part of this and the exploitative part of this, and they decide that they want to do their own thing. So we have all of these revolutions that happen in the early 18th century, and all of a sudden the home country is like, okay, we need to find a different way to do this. We need to find a different model to use. At the same time that they're rethinking this strategy of how to access foreign lands, the Industrial Revolution happens. And the Industrial Revolution happened, and we'll talk more about this when we get to industry in a couple of weeks. When the Industrial Revolution happens, it happens in Europe. And what we end up seeing is a big jump in technology, especially transportation technology and military technology, right? We can get places faster and easier, and we can have the power to force people to do what we need to do. All right. So now our strategy is, instead of sending a bunch of people there, a bunch of civilians there, a bunch of commoners to set up, schools and houses and recreate our society, and well, we're just going to convince, and I'm going to put the word convince in quotation marks, the native populations to do this for us, right? Why send a bunch of people that are going to go over there, get tired, and start a revolution when we can just use the native people to do this for us, right? So we're going to go over there in our steamships, which move really fast. We're going to build some railroads so we can move around, and we're going to use our military strength to enforce some new rules in places, right? So we look at India, we look at Africa, we look at Southeast Asia, we look at parts of Southwest Asia. We begin to look at eventually China, although China has some different kind of relationships. And basically what it is Europeans go in there, they make deals with powerful people within those countries, whether they be local chiefs or local kings or local political leaders, and those political leaders get a lot from the European countries in exchange for allowing the militaries of those countries to come in and basically force the people of those countries to extract and cultivate and mine and grow resources for the home country, right? So in India and Egypt, it was cotton. In the Congo, it was rubber and ivory. In South Africa, it was diamonds and other minerals. Whatever, right? We need raw materials in the Industrial Revolution. We need things that we can use to make other things, okay? We also need a place to sell our stuff because, England's a small country, only so many people there, right? However, the rest of the world's big, right? So we're going to go into India. We're going to use our military to kind of, control the country, and all of their production is going to go back to England. And we're going to go into the Congo, and we're going to use basically slave labor and commit genocide. And in the process, we're going to, extract ivory, we're going to extract rubber and send it back. And we are going to rake in, as Europeans, tons and tons and tons of profits. And we're going to do it with a very small number of people. Maybe a couple of thousand people is all it really took to control India, because they used their technological superiority through their military, and were very strategic in targeting certain political leaders in order to do that. So this is where imperialism, which is what I'm describing here, differs from colonialism. And now we're not trying to recreate European society and make, New England or new, whatever. We're not trying to do that. We're just trying to go in and get the resources that we want, take them out of the country, bring them back to our country where we can manufacture them, and then we're going to turn around and sell it to them. So India was not allowed to produce their own clothes. They had to buy them from the British. And they were made from cotton cultivated in India. So if I'm a cotton farmer, I'm not allowed to use the cotton that I grow. I have to sell it all to the British, who will then take it back to Britain. The textile mills in Manchester or Liverpool will convert it into cloth, and they'll sell the cloth back to me at a higher price. And so this was a way to use the technological and military superiority of European countries to gain access to resources and to gain access to markets. And we need to understand how these systems are different. We also need to understand some of the long-term impacts of this, right? So this system continues, pretty consistently through World War II. After World War II, we begin to see these systems being abandoned in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but in some places, right? And part of the reason why they're being abandoned is that the European societies, the European public, is really starting to question some of these practices, right? A lot of them would say, okay, we just went to war to fight Hitler for doing awesome bad stuff. Can we really afford to do bad stuff, right? Also, there was lots of issues with countries being able to continue to support armies in these places, and was it really worth it anymore, right? And then civil wars and rebellions would break out, and it was such a taxing on their resources that eventually people just started giving up their colonies because it just wasn't worth it anymore, right? So India gains its independence in 1940. 47, 49, one of those two. Much of Africa begins to gain its independence in the 1960s and 70s, things like that. Southeast Asia starts in the 1950s and kind of achieves that in the 1970s. So now we have all these independent states, and that's good, I guess, maybe, I don't know. But this kind of gets back to that original question: is that necessarily good for the countries? And there are arguments on both sides of that. Ultimately, I think self-determination and the ability to govern yourself and have power over your own life, I think, is ultimately an ultimate good. The problem is that a lot of times the imperialist powers did not necessarily leave people ready to rule themselves. So a lot of times the citizens of these countries were denied access to education. They were denied access to any kind of wealth. They were denied access to understanding of democratic structures. And so a lot of times they really struggled, and still do in a lot of places, to kind of come to terms with this. They also struggle economically, because they have been dependent for a long time on other people. So, for example, a very common economic problem that a lot of independent states, former colonies, struggle with is they have been working for a country for so long, working for some imperialist country, and that country still maintains a lot of influence. It still maintains a lot of exclusive trade rights. It may include different types of benefits that they get. They may have trouble diversifying their trade balance with other countries, and so that dependence upon that other country is still an important factor that they have to deal with and struggle with. Another problem that they've run into is one of borders, and that a lot of times European countries drew the borders of these areas based on what was best for them, based on how they needed to proceed, how they needed to do things, about how they were trying to maintain balance and peace with their European neighbors, right? So this led them to create boundaries that weren't necessarily appropriate. They might have been culturally inappropriate. They may have put ethnic groups together that don't like each other, right? And so when they became independent, now you have two rival ethnic groups fighting for power, which sometimes works out well, sometimes it doesn't. They would draw boundaries that might leave some countries with very little resources, which doesn't make any sense, right? Or landlocked countries, which doesn't make any sense, right? Or they would build infrastructure that was designed to be extractive, right? So our railroad goes from the coast to the rubber plantation and back, right? Well, is that necessarily the best model for building an economy around manufacturing? Or is that really the best for building an economy around agriculture? And those countries often, once were independent, lacked the funds and money to rebuild or redesign or reorganize that infrastructure in a way that made sense to them. So a lot of countries still struggle with some of the legacies of imperialism. In fact, a lot of them still have these legacies of imperialism. You also found that the legacy of those political leaders who were educated by the imperialist powers, who were made very wealthy by those imperialist powers, created huge economic imbalances and often led to dictatorships, because those individuals had the power to enforce those things, right? And so a lot of these countries, as they're trying to break out of this legacy of imperialism, a lot of times face challenges from within their country, from their own political leaders. So anyway, so there's some serious infrastructure issues that come from that. As a general rule, I like to tell my class, if you have to be colonized, pray it's the British, because the British at least leave you something usable, like, you know, railroads and a language that is fairly common, and, you know, a British education system. I'm not at all saying that imperialism is good, but, you know, if we have to be, you know, imperial, although the Dutch didn't do horrible things either, or as bad of things. Anyway, so yeah, those two concepts are important to remember, and kind of how those processes impact and affect, those continue to affect those things moving forward. So, okay. That's about all the time we have today. We've gone about 50 minutes, which is a little longer than I wanted to, but that's fine. So next week, we are going to look at agriculture, which is also one that I like a lot, even though my students think it's the most boring, but that's okay. They just, you know, I'm into farming. What can I say? All right. Anyway, so I'm going to let y'all go for the evening, and please, you know, get your questions in for next week, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.